It's so fun. Like last night, I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. I don't usually think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction, and so it's a lovely thing to see. And
that's fantastic.
It's unbelievable. Not even third world country 30 years ago look like California right now, like downtown. You go down to the library. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it's like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's
library?
Unbelievable. It's in the library. I mean, you should do a total segment on the library, a public library downtown Los Angeles, and I'm telling you, it's unbelievable. It's like Sodom and Gomorrah.
In Sweden, the government is forcing preschools to be gender neutral. Yes, it's just as crazy as it sounds. A school ignoring basic biology. Children in Sweden can go to preschool as young as 1 year old. In these government-mandated gender-neutral classrooms for tots, teachers hold training events to indoctrinate toddlers in radical, progressive, anti-science gender theory. Training events. Can you say communist social engineering? Can you say creepy?
When you look at who is the power base behind gender ideology, these groups are the ones with the power. They are the ones with the money, whether it comes from the government or whether it comes from George Soros, who has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to promote this ideology is to destroy man and woman marriage, destroy the family, and once you destroy gender, you have no basis for man-woman family. So this is a definite political attempt to completely eradicate the basis for man-woman marriage and gender, because once that's destroyed, you have no foundation.
It's social engineering, but it's worse. The students aren't allowed to say boys and girls. They're only allowed to say friends. Does that ring a familiar bell, comrade? They aren't allowed to use gender-specific pronouns like he or she. They're indoctrinated only to use gender-neutral pronouns like hen. If the little girls are too girly and the little boys too boyish, teachers reprimand the parents for, quote, gender mistreatment.
The school is not the place to indoctrinate kids into changing genders or giving them books to show them that they need to change genders or that there's all these things going on.
See, this is part of the progressive agenda. Replace God with government. Tear the family apart by sabotaging marriage. Tear marriage apart by redefining institutions that have existed in our world for thousands of years.
Perhaps that's why the left is so determined in this country to get Christianity out of the classroom. But tell us something of the chilling...
There's no doubt that's why they're determined. I mean, people like Derrida, I mean, he called the West phallogocentric, right? Male-dominated, logos-centric. It's like, that is the West. It's logocentric. Well, if you want to take the West down, you remove the idea of the divine word from the substructure of the society. So you have to do that. It's like, and this is the level at which this war is being fought. It's fundamentally a theological war.
Interesting.
People don't like to think that, but well. The freedom of speech. You say, well, speech is the right to freedom of speech is central because it's the right by which you defend all the other rights. Well, that's why the idea of logos in the West is the most sacred concept, right? So Christ, if you think about this psychologically, Christ is the ideal of perfection. Now, this is independent of any religious discussion or any historical accuracy. It doesn't matter. What Christ represents is the perfect individual, whatever that is. Now, you discuss endlessly what that is. But one of the things the West has settled on is the idea, well, that the perfect individual utters the truthful speech that makes potential into habitable order. Does that through truth. And that's embedded in the first few sentences in Genesis, for example, when God brings the world into being. So, and the idea that truthful speech that brings the world into being from formless potential also characterizes each person. That's our our fabrication in the image of God. That's the idea of the West. It's an unbelievably remarkable idea that perfection, individual perfection, is to be found in a relationship with spoken truth. God, that's the great idea. Well, it's out of that arises the observation that there's nothing more central to the hierarchy of rights and obligations as well, let's say, than freedom of speech. Yes, it's absolutely central. That's why Christ is the Word made flesh. The idea is that the perfect individual is the person who speaks truth, but also acts out the truth of those words. It's a proposition whose merit is virtually self-evident when you understand it in that manner. So yeah, to see assaults on freedom of speech, especially compelled speech, well, that's where I drew the line.
And what I realize now in looking back, because now I have 73 years of history of real life experience of dealing with transgender issues on some level, whether it's the experience of being a child who felt like he should have been a different gender, or going through the teen years and adult years and eventually undergoing surgery. What I realize is that the worst thing that happened to me was being affirmed by my grandmother, in that the idea was that there was something wrong with being a boy. And so when you begin to affirm someone in the opposite gender, it's a bigger picture than that, because what you're really saying is there's something wrong with who you are. So how do you fix that? And once that seed was planted in me, I call today the seed of gender dysphoria, as it grew, it began to take over my thinking, and it began to play in my head every moment of the day. It was like having a radio on that would never stop playing, that just continued to tell me that I was born in the wrong body, or that there was something wrong with me as a boy. Wouldn't it have been wonderful if Grandma would have just sat me down and said, "Walt, you're a very handsome young man. You don't need to change genders. Let me affirm you as a young boy. Let me help you realize who you are." But that did not happen. And it's not happening today.
And I read his book, The Gulag Archipelago. Here is this man who describes the horrors of being a political prisoner because he disagrees. He converted. He was originally a supporter of communism. He came to see how evil it was and how oppressive it was. He was imprisoned for having a different view to the state-ordained insistence that everything was terrific. And he writes unbelievably that lying on his prison bunk one day, listening to the guards beat up a fellow prisoner, the screams and the yells, he found freedom when he realised the dividing line between good and evil, in fact, didn't lie between captor and captive. In fact, the jailers were captive too, to a system, to a blind ideology, to an inability to think freely.
Most of them were trustees, so they were perpetrating the very system that imprisoned them.
Not between Catholic and Baptist, he wrote, not between woman and man, not between black and white, but the dividing line between evil actually lies somewhere across every human heart. Plainly, you believe it's incredibly important that we understand that. Comes back to what you said. I think when it's framed, we understand it.
Everyone knows that.
Everyone knows it.
If they think, because all they have to do is think about their own transgressions. I mean, if you ask someone to sit for 5 minutes and think, okay, well, what mistakes have you made in your life? It's like, that'll come up pretty quickly. And you can even ask people, well, what terrible, unforgivable mistakes have you made in your life? It's like, yeah, well, we know about those too. It's like, it's no one's so naive, unless they've really wrestled intensely against themselves. There's virtually no one so naive to not be able to answer those questions.
Are we doing our children a massive disservice by trying to imply that there's nothing wrong with them, no need for guilt, no need for shame, no need to come to grips with evil?
This is so...
Because the problem's the environment?
Well, one of the things that's so funny about what's happened...
The problem is that we've just got to fix society, fix the institutions,
well...
and then all this will disappear?
Psychologists have been... Not all psychologists, obviously, but the psychological profession is neck deep in this pathology, has been beating the self-esteem drum for 50 years. Oh no, you're okay. You should feel good about yourself. Like, you're fine the way you are. It's like you think, well, that's a calming message for people. It's like, no, it's not. It's not at all. And I watch my audiences. It's like, it's full of people in the audience who think, I'm suffering a lot more than I think is tenable. A whole bunch of it's my fault. My life is not in the order it should be. I know I'm doing 50 things wrong. It's like, what the hell's wrong with me? What's wrong with the people around me? This is really serious. And some, well-meaning person comes up and says, you're okay just the way you are. It's like, no one wants that message. It's like, no, I'm not okay the way I am. If you're a mess, you know it. Obviously, you're suffering away like so much you can barely tolerate it. It's like, that's okay. You could do something about it.
So
And that's the thing that turns the lights on. It's like, you
Yeah.
could do something about it. It's like, oh.
So they're
something
in a
about it.
freezing prison cell in the most appalling circumstances, half starved to death. He finds freedom in himself. He finds something positive and something to live for by first coming to grips with evil and understanding what it is. There's a
and
conundrum in there.
And he said too, and he underwent the Christian process of metanoia, which is to go over it's confession essentially and repentance.
I reverted back after 8 years of realizing that it's totally foolish, that it's categorically impossible to change your biological gender sex. You can make yourself look different. You can fool people into thinking you look different, but you're not. And so today, as I've been studying and writing, I've written 5 books, and I do a lot of research work. And when I began to go back and see what was been going on with this, and I first looked early on at the 3 people who kind of started it in the U.S., Kinsey, Benjamin, and Dr. Money. And guess what? All 3 of them were pedophile activists. This is the kind of people that were leading the charge in the U.S. on advocating for cutting body parts off and filling people with hormones. How barbaric. It's like Frankenstein when you think about how gross it is to cut people up like they're a piece of meat at the supermarket and then try to identify them in a different gender. It's total insanity. But we sort of walk around and go, well, we don't want to offend anybody. People say that I'm too harsh. Well, how harsh is it for them to cut body parts off that didn't need to be cut off? How harsh was it for them to tell me that you could change genders when it's a total lie?
It is famous Waterloo lectures, the inaugural Blaise Pascal lecture in 1978. Malcolm Muggeridge said the West was in danger of eating itself out from within, and he spoke at great length about this attempt to, about how the West was abandoning Christianity and it had become a very empty and soulless and financially bankrupt place as a result. But it wouldn't be the end. He said, despite the attempts to kill it in places like communist China and Russia, there will always be people who will fight through to the truth. And of course, we can see now, 3 decades on, whatever, that he was absolutely right. Closer to 4 decades on, he was right.
Well, you know that Christianity is spreading faster in communist China than it did in Rome during its most rapid period of expansion in terms of proportion of people transforming. So Christianity is spreading incredibly quickly in China, which is well, who would have guessed that, right? I mean, that just makes you shake your head.
But I started to study psychology at UC Santa Cruz in California, and I began to crack open books I'd never looked at on psychology. And it became clear to me, I wasn't a doctor, but it became clear to me that this is a psychological issue that's not going to be treated with medical therapies. While no one else could seem to figure that out, it seemed clear to me. Isn't that funny? That was, early in the 80s, and today still we're treating this as though it's a medical condition. No one yet today can actually show a medical report. Somebody can come in and say, I have gender dysphoria. There isn't one doctor that can pass or give a test to this person and put it up on a screen and say, oh yeah, you have gender dysphoria. We take it at their word. It's a self-diagnosed disorder. And what we know today is, as I stand here, is the procedure failed. I reverted back after 8 years of realizing that it's totally foolish.
If you think this gender-neutral mandate, this social engineering, this indoctrination, this abuse won't come here to the United States, think again.
Political power, political power. Guess who's in charge? Guess who's getting the money? This is the political power. And the people who are in power are these people who believe in this ideology, even though there is absolutely no proof that it is successful. In fact, everything points to the fact that it does more harm than it does good. We have a political group of people who are promoting changing genders that's causing people to attempt suicide, and yet they're totally blind to it. We've known this for over 40 years.
Diversity, actually, I mean, there's no other way to put it. In this country, it's rapidly coming to mean a stifling conformity. You dare not deviate from the line. And you see it with a whole lot of other words that are bandied around, equality being one of them,
Yep.
because it's confused. Equality of opportunity is confused with equality of outcome.
Well, the initial wedge was equality of opportunity, and then that flew, and so, well, no, it's equality of outcome. That's equity. And that's, I cannot believe how rapidly that idea, which is the ultimate and terrible ideas, I can't believe how rapidly that spread, and how little people criticize it. Well, that's because to uninformed analysis, it sounds good if you're feeling carelessly compassionate. You can't play the identity politics game. Well, so what do you do instead? You live the mythologically heroic life as an individual. That's the right place to work. And that's the message of the West. What's the metric by which people should be measured? And the answer is they should be measured as individuals, as if they have a divine soul. They should be measured in that manner.
But it can't be a selfish thing. That is to say, if I recognise I have worth and dignity, I'm obliged to recognise that so do you.
I think you can't recognize that you have intrinsic worth and dignity without also recognizing it in others. And vice versa. I don't think that I can recognize the worth of another person without stumbling onto the idea that I also have to recognize that for myself. When did you think, well, everyone would want that, but well, people don't, because you're also charged with the responsibility of your own care, as if you matter. Well, that's a big responsibility. It's a lot easier to assume that everything is pointless. I mean, that's painful and all of that, but well, you don't bear any responsibility then.
And no one lives that way.
No, well, not for long.
Not for long. Well, not for long, exactly.
From 1979, when Ihlenfeld talked about too much unhappiness and too many suicides, the one key thing in 2018 is, today, there's still too much unhappiness and too many suicides because it's not working. But then you can look at 2004. The UK Guardian published a report that was done for the University of Birmingham. The University of Birmingham looked at 100 studies on the consequences or results or effects of doing gender reassignment surgery and hormone therapy. You know what the headline was after they had reviewed these? They said gender reassignment surgery is not effective. That people after undergoing reassignment surgery are traumatized to the point of suicide after undergoing the surgery. Okay, we got Ihlenfeld saying too many suicides. He said they need psychiatric care. We got a study of 100 studies done in the UK that said it's not effective. And we're still doing it today.
Of the miracle of Western freedom. The idea that every individual has worth and dignity and standing.
It's the idea that killed slavery.
It changed the way the world thought, even though there are evil people who still keep slaves. And here's a rub. It was plainly led by people of profound Christian faith. There's no other way of putting it.
No, that's
Anyone who
absolutely
honestly, and that's truthfully looks at the history of that period can't get away from it.
Yeah.
But because it doesn't suit the modern left's narrative, it's airbrushed out. Doesn't that in itself say something profound about our willingness to try and distort truth
It's
to suit our
It's hard to
objectives?
say what it speaks of. You know, it's hard. It's like the whitewashing of what happened in the Soviet states, you know, in the communist states in the 20th century. I mean, anybody who goes through that literature with any degree of care comes away traumatized, right? Shell-shocked. It's just it's everything the Nazis did on a larger scale.
Politicians in California already want to throw nurses in jail who accidentally misgender their patients. In the UK, a teacher was fired for referring to his class in an all-girls school as, "Okay, girls, let's get started." There was a student who identified as transgender in his class. The teacher didn't even know it. He was fired anyway. If we are not brave enough to speak up and say, biology is biology, it's not bigotry, girls are girls and boys are boys, and they are equal, but they are scientifically different, then this is going to happen here in America next.
You're doing a great job of
Thank you.
modelling courage in the face of fire.
Well, there's something I'd like to say, maybe in closing, about courage. People say that to me, and you know, I don't think it's exactly right. There's a line in the Old Testament: "The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom," and I think it's more like that. It's not that I'm courageous; it's that I'm afraid of the right things. So when I made my videos, it wasn't like that didn't make me nervous, but I was less nervous about going back to bed and not saying what I had to say than I was about making the videos, because I know where this is going. I don't want to go there.
That's something beautiful that your wife said to you. In reality, we are all broken somehow, right?
He said we're all broken, and we all need the redemption of Christ, and we've grown together in our faith, and we've been married now for 20 years. Thank you.
So we don't want to, you know, it's Pascal talked of the glory and the scum. To reach our full humanity, it seems to me we need to understand both in tension.
Now, Carl Jung
The
said
unbelievable scum that lies in terms of our potential at the bottom of every heart. The extraordinary nobility, you call it the spark of divinity, I would say made in the image of a mighty creator. You've got to hold those things in suspension if you to find your real humanity. And in fact,
You
the
even
way
have to
through to
develop
the good place is surely through the valley of darkness in the first place.
Well, then you know that's you think, well, if it's possible to be enlightened, why isn't everyone enlightened? It's like, well, you don't get to paradise, you don't get to heaven without harrowing hell first, right? And who's going to do that? Like, that's a terrible thing to do. It isn't even clear that you can survive it. No, I mean, it's brutally damaging to come to terms with your own proclivity for malevolence, and so people don't do it, and it's no wonder. But the funny thing is, and this is also something that I think that people who've been watching my lectures have been attracted by, especially the young men. It's like, until you understand that you're a monster, until perhaps you even develop that as a capacity, you don't have the moral force to do good. And so not only is that descent to begin with necessary to scare you straight, right, to make you understand what exactly it is that you're dealing with, but you don't even have the strength of character to be good until you understand just exactly what sort of monster you can be. Like, that doesn't work. And so you watch the people around you who thrive, regardless of what they say, they act out the proposition that everyone matters. And then you have a functional society. And I think, okay, well, if when you act out the proposition that everyone matters, you have a functional society, maybe that's evidence that that proposition is true. It's like, I think it's true. I think the idea that the individual has a spark of divinity within him or her, I think there isn't a more true way of saying that. And if you act that out, well, goes back to the idea that you brought up about potential, which is also something I've discussed with my audiences a lot. It's like, we don't act like we live in a material reality. We act like we face a landscape of potential, an external landscape of potential, with an internal reservoir of potential. That's how we act. And then we call each other out on it. We say things like, well, you're not living up to your potential. And the person goes, so yeah, well, I know. It's like, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Well, you mean there's more to you than meets the eye. Even though it's not measurable, right? It's not tangible. It's just possibility. But everyone acts as though that's a reality. And we all act as if we make choices about what reality to bring into being. We punish ourselves for our moral errors and other people as well. We act out this ethic that puts us each at the center of being as active participants in the world that we want to bring forward. Everyone acts that way. And if we don't, then things go to hell instantly. So it's like, well, what do we believe? This is the argument I've had with people like Sam Harris, the atheist types. It's like, yeah, you think you're atheist, man. It's like, you're Christian, Judeo-Christian, let's say, to the core. You just don't understand it. You just don't realize it. And it's understandable, but it's not helpful.
A relationship with Jesus. I know you have a Christian faith, but I would like to know what's the role that the Christian faith play when you were in the hole and they rescue.
The rescue. Well, I think, the Lord never left me, I left the Lord. And so when I began to start working my way back to dealing with these issues, I sat down with, and this is the last question, right? I sat down with a Christian therapist, and we began to talk about my life just as we are today and all the painful things that had happened. And so as we went through these things, I had written them down on a yellow lined piece of paper, and we went outside his office and put a match to them and torched them and let them go away in the air. And he said, let's go back in and pray. And so we went back into his office, and he was one of these people who would pray for hours at a time. I was a person who would pray for a minute at a time and be done with it. But he wanted to pray. And so I went back and began to pray with him. And during that time of prayer, which I had already confessed to the Lord that I had lived my life wrong and I wanted to be redeemed and restored, and I had been working toward that end. During that prayer, with my eyes closed, the Lord came to me in white. He was reaching out to me, and I looked during this prayer, and I could see myself as a little baby wrapped in cloth, and the Lord picked me up. I could see that it was me, and he held me in his arms, and the Lord spoke to me and said, you are now safe with me forever. And at that point, I was redeemed and restored and have been ever since. Thank you.
If I lay out the rationale for the Christian ethic, which is something like pick up your damn cross and struggle uphill, which is a really good message, they think, oh yeah, well that makes a lot of sense. It's like, well, I don't need the metaphysical baggage. It's like, well, maybe you do and maybe you don't, but even to pick up the practical utility of that idea, which is overwhelming, that's an excellent start. I was thinking the other day, a journalist asked me why people are responding so positively to what I'm saying, the young men, for example, and I thought, why? Yeah, that's a good question. He says, well, I'm actually on their side. I'm really happy that they're not wasting their lives. I'm really sad to see that people are disenchanted and nihilistic and depressed and anxious and aimless and perverse and vengeful and all of those things. It's terrible. And then to see people question whether that's necessary and then to start to rise out of it. It's like, it's so fun. Like last night I was after my talk, it's overwhelming. I don't usually think about these things, but I was after my talk last night, and so all these people line up, and they have their 15 seconds with me, and they're kind of tentative. They're excited and attentive when they come up to talk to me, and then they have 15 seconds of time to tell me something. I'm really listening to them, and they're hesitant about whether or not to share the good news about their life. And I think it's often because when people share good news about their life, people don't necessarily respond positively. They don't get encouragement. And people need so little encouragement. It's just unbelievable. And so they'll tell me something good, and I think, oh, that's so good. Somebody says, oh, I'm getting along way better with my father. I hadn't seen him for 10 years, and now we get along. It's like, God, great. And then the power of that, you can't overstate the power of that for individuals to get their life together. The individual is an unbelievably powerful force, and every single person who gets their act together a little bit has the capacity to spread that around them. It's a chain reaction, and so it's a lovely thing to see.
That's fantastic.